So good morning and welcome to today's hangout with Mark Hull and Time to Think. And it's really lovely that we have this time on a Thursday morning to think. So welcome to everybody, and particularly Mark. So Mark, perhaps I could just ask you to say a few words about yourself.
Thank you, Philip. Gosh, that's a difficult start to the morning. What shall I say about myself? Well, I'm old. I've been kicking around health service for about 40 years. And last year they said to me, why don't we give you a fat check to just go away? And I said, well, that'd be lovely. So for the past year, I've had the opportunity to try because of freelance, and my practice tends to be around things like leadership development and organisation development. That's the sort of work I've done. In fact, for the 40 years in and around health and social care, it's been work around development, whether it's people development. I did a period of employment development at St Thomas's Hospital. So it's developmental focus on leadership and organisation development. I'm very lucky here to be connected to John Higgins, who's also on the call today. John and I started working together when I was at the NHS London Leadership Academy, which is probably about 8 years ago, I think. And since that time, we've collaborated across a range of activities, particularly in terms of producing books. So our process tends to be, as John described, I produce an impenetrable essay, and John takes the essay and creates something that human beings can read. So that's our working process, and we've got a number of books that have been published, including one last year called The Great at That's a terrifying thing. I've popped up as a huge floating head on the screen. Right, what else was I going to share? I was going to share quickly.
Now, Mark, just before you continue any further, I know you were going to say something about your voice.
That's exactly what I'm about to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
That's okay. So people may be thinking, what's wrong with his voice? And this is the answer. About 20 years ago, I got a diagnosis of this delightful sounding, sounds like a musical instrument, spasmodic dysphonia, which means at certain points my vocal cords are open when they should be shut, and at other points they're shut when they should be open. So you get this kind of slightly stilted quality, which can affect people's attention. So I will do the best I can in terms of speaking. If at any point you think to yourself, did he just say, just give a call, just interrupt and say, can you repeat what you just said? Because I can appreciate how difficult it is to try and listen to this. It's not too bad at the moment, but it gets us at the course of the hour. There are two ways in which I can, there's a treatment and a way in which I can sometimes manage it. The treatment is to have a Botox injection, which is quite attractive because I could probably do Botox here now. It's a Botox injection right into the voice box, which can leave you silent rather than being able to speak. The other thing I can do, I have to be quite cautious about this, is actually if I move up into the register, if I go a little higher, it actually just disappears and I can manage speaking a lot easier. The trouble was, as I was saying to Philippa and Chris and John and Rick before we started the session, when I move into that position, I have to speak like somebody from Bridgerton or Downton Abbey. So I'm not sure why that is. So at certain points, if I'm really struggling to get something out, I may switch to this, but it's not for comic effect. I appreciate it does have a comical feel to it. It just allows me to speak slightly less pressured. I'd prefer to try and do it at my normal register, if at all possible. So I'm going to stop there and go back to Philippa and see what the next step is.
So, Mark, we asked you to talk about time to think, or when we were talking about things, and I think the plan is that you share some things and then we might divide into a few breakout groups just to have a bit of a conversation about it, also to give your voice a bit of a rest. and then to come back together just to share thoughts. And because as ever in this, we don't want this to be a conversation. We want this to be a conversation, not a broadcast at people.
Absolutely.
But we are,
To
Philippa, we are
these
happy.
pop-ups, we know that.
We are also happy for people to make comments in the chat as we go along, and we'll try to respond to anything that comes up, spoken or in writing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Mark, over to you. And I know if you want to, because you've worked closely with John, if John, what you want to join in with what Mark's saying, please do. John, I should say, for those who don't know, is GameShift's research fellow, and he's done a lot of work with Mark over the years. Do you want to say something, John, just to say hello?
I'll just say hello. I think it's all.
Neatly done.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I was thinking about what sort of themes I wanted to touch upon this morning, and I've got 4 kind of general topics that I'll just try and touch on and explore some facets of. The first is, because we're talking about time to think, first is to have a look at the issue of time and our relationship to time as human beings, potentially our relationship to time in corporate settings as well. The second aspect was thinking about structures and systems that experience in organizations, particularly the fact we tend to focus on structure at the expense of looking at networks and systems. The third is to just give some thought to the practices of leadership and management and the extent to which that you can quite significantly inhibit people's capacity to take time to think, not just to take time to think, but engage in conversation, as we've described this morning. A critical quality of conversation in a corporate setting is it connects people, gives people the opportunity to converse, and that's very important from my perspective. And then I'll finish with some observations about being and doing. So just what does it feel like in corporate settings? And the idea of covering these 4 themes is just to give us some material, just opinions. It's not research based, it's a philosophical opinion to go and think to what extent does this resonate with? Does this sound accurate? What other things do I see alongside this? And just have a conversation about how can we create a circumstance in corporate life where it feels more generous, where there's greater capacity for people to act, and a better capacity to talk and to think and to come up with fresh ideas. So let me start just thinking about. I'm going to go up now. Let me just start by thinking about time, and I wanted to begin by just making an observation about existentialism, which is a current fascination of mine because I'm doing some work on that, the relationship of existentialism in terms of the practicalities of the workplace. In existential thought, one of the key observations is that 1 minute we don't exist, and the next minute we do. We don't exist, and then we appear. That's quite sudden. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to navigate that circumstance of coming into existence. This is something that Heidegger calls thrown. Is we are thrown into the world without permission. We have to then find out through the world. And Sartre takes quite interesting additions to that by talking about transcendence, which is how do we live our lives through our choices, our decisions, how do we transcend circumstances we find ourselves in. And second, he talks about facticity. So we're not just thrown into the world, we appear in the world with a surrounding of culture, ideas, problems, which we then have to work through. What's critical about this, from my perspective, is it's a reminder at time, particularly finitude, is a critical aspect of human existence. And we are very mindful in many ways of just that fact, that we have limited time in which to live our lives. And of course, we live our lives a great deal in work. And so finding a way of existing at work in relationship to time is extremely important. Now, second point I want to make about time just to make an observation, general observation about how broad brushstrokes of time tend to get thought about in business settings. So on the one hand, people will tend to talk about the past as a graveyard of mistakes and failed ideas. So most settings is, we're trying to past, there's very little to celebrate. And then the other side of that is the idea of the future, which again is simply a privileged state where senior leadership has tended to sit about and say, well, we've got a vision and a mission, a strategy and a plan. And this is where we're headed. Join with us and come to the future. And meanwhile, all of us are sitting in what's called the spacious present, sitting in the present, trying to live our lives, trying to navigate spaces, trying to do as best we can in corporate circumstances. But we're being told the past is a dead space, and we're being told the future is something we have not designed, but has written, sketched out, and blueprinted by others, and it's something to which we should aspire. So that absence of the present, the fact that the present is where we live our lives, the fact that it doesn't really feature in a corporate setting, is really important in terms of getting us to think, to what extent does organizational life give me space and capacity to really engage with the practicalities of what I'm being asked to do and how I do it? Or am I just constantly turning my back on the past and trying to stare into the future? Of course, the critical thing is that work has always been shaped by time, just in some fashion, but traditionally, particularly in agricultural settings, shaping of that time has tended to be about sunrise and sunset and the changing of the seasons. That's how we manage time in the workplace. For many, many years, we just took nature as our clock, and that's what guided us in terms of the things we were planning to do and how we were going to do them. Of course, when we reach machine age, when machines begin to come to existence and industrialization takes place, there is one crucial machine that makes its appearance and changes the terrain of the world. That is the timepiece, the clock, or watch. It's a time machine. And instead of allowing us as human beings to think about the sun has just come up, that's the morning, I'll work till noon when somebody high, that time machine calibrated things down into seconds, minutes, hours, years. And of course, once that shift occurred and other machines took their place in terms of industrial production, we started to move away from just thinking about as dictated by the shifts. And instead, we were working into tight requirements of time. So people moved from piecework to piecework. Suddenly they were being paid for their time. Once they were being paid for their time, then we see a flare of managerialism. Once people are paid for their time, you need a manager to tell them what to do and to get them to do it quicker and to do it faster and to increase the capacity of the they're producing. So the machine gives us the clock. The clock really seizes our soul as human beings and means that we tend then just to think about time in its tiniest fragments in terms of seconds and minutes. And of course, we can see that in cultural developments at the start of the 20th century. If you look at the futurist artists in Italy, whose manifestos were uncomfortably aligned with fascism, they're talking about the delight, the fetishization of speed and machinery. And so from the early 20th century, workplaces all about quick, let's do things quick. And that fascination with speed cuts down the time that there might be to think, not just to think, but to share with others, and not just to share with others, but to exchange, and not just to exchange, but to experiment. So that machine is quite significant in that sense. Let me move on to the second thing, to look at centrality of structure. We talk a huge amount about structure in organisation life, and people doing organisation design get very, very hung up about structure in many ways. So when John and I published a book called Leadership Unwrapped. We looked at two things. We looked at some paradoxes in organizational life, and we looked at some myths. And again, this was just opinion on our part. We looked at our experiences and said, well, the biggest myth that seems to dominate managerialist thinking is the idea that everything is fixable. And that really is a dominant perspective in corporate life. There's nothing that cannot be fixed. Once you accept that, if there are many people have, you then come to the second perspective we shared, which was the only state worth pursuing is perfection. And so we're looking at fixability, a perfect response, and that means the third is there's only one true way of doing things. Now, once you collapse those three myths together, you have a circumstance where people don't feel that they're allowed to engage with others to explore, but instead governed by these thoughts. These thoughts deny the opportunity to engage with or to make sense. Sense making is vitally important to test, to see how they might do things differently. I want to talk a bit, the second aspect is the about the work of Carl Weick and Harold Bridger, two writers that have considerable influence on in terms of getting to think about what goes on under the surface of organizations. So Weick in 1969 produced a book called Social Psychology of Organizations. He makes a simple distinction between what goes on in organizational space, which is there is organizing, which is people coming together to get stuff done. That kind of ferment of activity that people are pursuing an ambition, very often in quite informal fashion. And he talks about organization, kind of carapace that rises, a bureaucratic structure that sits on top of organizing and can often constrain it. So that distinction strikes me important when I'm looking at organizational. If I think to myself, I don't want to see the structure, I don't want to see the organ. I want to hear how people how are they getting stuff done, because that's what's important. The second writer is Harold Bridger, Wilfred Bion, did a huge work around group dynamics, particularly psychodynamic perspective on groups. Bridger talks about two things. First is that he talks about the primary task, which is what is the business set up to deliver. And that primary task is about process, procedure, structure. How does stuff get done in terms of practical activity, logistics of delivering? But he talks about double task, which is the how and why that things occur in terms of the human connections that sit underneath. So my observation here is it's possible to intersect these two writers if you take Weick's idea of organising an organisation, if you take Bridger's view of primary tasks, second task, a sense of how there's a potential to think about organisational life at a less superficial level, whereas most of the time we're skating on the surface, just looking at very superficial activities when we could be looking at a low depth and taking time to get into the fabric of the organization and to say, the structure says this, it says person A is the boss of person B and C, person B and C, the bosses of D, E, and F. Actually, when it comes to practicalities of work, all manner of things may also be going on there. Importantly, there's a link here in terms of thinking about unknowability and uncertainty, because so much corporate life tells us, no, I've got control of the work, it's absolutely fine. But if there's one thing a pandemic should have taught everyone from frontline to board, is it that the world is complex, and the idea we can know the world in a practical sense, and that we can be certain about what will happen, and that we can then intervene in the world in quite a mechanical way by pushing the switch an outcome occurs is absurd. It's a fine example of hubris. Despite the pandemic and people's experience of it, we are slipping back to a circumstance where people are going back to that slightly scientific world, leadership in particular talks a lot about busyness and pace. So there's a distinction, I think, between managers and leaders, and I'm happy to explore that if people are interested to hear opinions about it. But because leaders very often are immersed in a practice which is somewhat distant from the actuality of business that they're involved in, they can very often be completely focused on busyness and pace and performance and delivery. Those are the key factors that leaders get excited about. And so they visit that on the people who work, and also, in many instances, because of the circumstances they occupy, they tend to get fascinated by the idea that busyness and pace are, in some ways, badges of pride for leaders. So I can think of one leader with whom I worked who would regularly show me her diary and say, "Mark, look at my diary. It's packed from 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock." And I was a subaltern voice, so I didn't have the courage to speak up. But clearly, I used to think to myself, but you're a director. If you can't take control of your own diary, how can you be expected to control a complex organisation full of people? But there's a certain pride in it as well. It wasn't just expression of misery. It wasn't how sad I am. If it's like this, it was, look how important I am. So that's another aspect of time. If your time is consumed, that tends to translate into some of corporate importance. When we talk about leadership, we tend to still, despite the Heathrow Academy having grown shows of books of all sorts of interesting things, it's servant leadership or dispersed leadership or all manner. It's 57 varieties of leadership, but there's one variety that prevails, which is the quite traditional heroic individual that still persists. If that kind of leadership, the practicalities of allowing people space to think, to get an opportunity to talk, tends to disappear. What we tend to have is a unidirectional exchange between the person defined as leader and the people are seeking to lead, who, of course, these days get called followers, which is always an interesting term, which one, but that makes me quite uncomfortable. The other side of that is that people start to talk about, but
Sorry, Mark, could you just say that word again? I didn't quite catch it, that people are called just a second ago.
Oh, God.
It began with F. I'm really sorry, I didn't catch it. Maybe somebody else didn't.
It's followers. It's
Followers.
Followers.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now as people are looking at me thinking, is this just a bot talking to us? I have turned into a bot. Thank you. Philip, how am I doing for time? Okay, that's fine. That looks like a positive gesture. Other people might disagree. They're probably sitting thinking, when's he going to shut up? So the other side is kind of post-bureaucratic of leadership that we talk about. Teal organizations, flat organizations. There's a fantastic essay written by a woman called Jo Friedman, who was part of the women's movement as it started to move from kind of self-awareness into activity and action. And she wrote an article called, an essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And it literally says, yes, you can talk all about flat structure and such, and she was talking about obviously activist groups, but reality is some structure is required. And if we do look at that notion of post-bureaucratic organisation, you tend to see some HBR articles that explore this. You tend to see a growth of managerialist practice occur across the terrain of the organisation, with people buried into a fresh structure. So instead of a traditional pyramid, you've got some sort of fractal shape. Each point of the fractal has somebody stepping into a managerialist position, so it doesn't disappear, just get swapped up in a shroud. And the real challenge with managerialism is it is constantly focused, as I said, in terms of leadership as well, focused on pace, setting targets, getting people to look at pace, getting stuff done, and constant demand. which doesn't give space. Pace does not, or space in which to say, are we doing what we're meant to be doing? Is there a different way of doing it? It's because you're too busy just wrapping up the KPIs every month and saying, no, we met the target. The target's absolutely fine. And that's worse as you've got more and more neoliberal thinking to corporate settings, and particularly the public sector. You see, new public management has really taken hold, and management in those contexts much just about do, and do quickly. So just to conclude, obviously from perspective of John and I, we are very mindful that organizations are written through like a stick of rock with power. Power, hierarchy, and command are very often default position for organizational structures. And that's a challenge, because once you accept that power, you allow that power to structure the organization. Once you accept the hierarchy, as if it's something natural, which of course the writer John Child contests that notion. It's not a natural circumstance, but if you accept that ideologically, it inhibits the opportunity to speak, to take time. Again, is another aspect of pace. The other issue of power in that context is, of course, that people enjoy the position of power. There is a more contemporary notion of power which talks about how groups of people can exercise power in quite subtle ways. And secondly, just the collection of data, information, the existence of knowledge really does shape things like what's normal and what's an outlier. And once you've got normal and others, if you think about the bell curve, the centre of the bell curve is the bit that's normal, and then the outliers sit at other ends, and they can be a problem. And so power operates structuring that and tends to push the outliers towards the centre. You know, if you want to survive, if you don't want to be an outlier, you don't want to be other, you want to be part of the mainstream. So that tends to happen into that perspective. The other thing a corporate life tends to swallow is Darwinian ideas of the survival of the fittest. What's really important about Darwin is, of course, the science and holding to the science. But there is a contrasting perspective offered by the anarchist Peter Kropotkin. And Kropotkin talks about mutual aid. So instead of survival of the fittest, he talks about particularly human beings coming together to work, to get stuff done, particularly at times of crisis. And there's a writer called Ray Firth who published a book recently called Disaster Anarchy. She looks at a whole range of events across the globe, such as Hurricane Katrina. She talks about the COVID pandemic, the COVID pandemic. She describes how people collectively came together to act, very often to act in spaces the state surrendered. So expect the state to step in, particularly in the Hurricane Katrina example. Further, the state failed to deliver the support the people needed in the city. What happened is groups, informal groups, began to appear. And that's critically important, because to contrast survival the fittest, which is the heroic leader model, oh, but look at Alan Sugar and Richard Branson and all those big entrepreneurs. They would presumably be the fittest who survived. But in contrast, we would like to talk about the idea of mutual aid, and linked with mutual aid, the idea of collective intelligence, which is something we, as a human species, desperately need to come to terms with, because the problems we face in a corporate setting and in a global space are required us to work in terms of collective intelligence. John and I published a book last year called The Great Unheard of Work, which looks at voice and silence in the workplace. That's a whole separate theme, but critically, we've kind of focused in It's like idea of silence. So time to think is one thing. If you haven't got the space and the opportunity to speak, to express your ideas, and if you're confident about saying out loud, then you will silence yourself. The time granted to you is not necessarily of that much value. Just to finish, the practicality is dialogue is central from my perspective to organizational success and to people's well-being in an organizational setting. It cannot flourish in contexts where busyness, pace, and a focus on action instead of conversation is foregrounded. Instead, we could be talking about criticality, reflexivity, and engagement ethics. But the time to engage with complex ideas is very often limited. If you just want 2 examples where that requirement we should be able to speak together diminished and had deleterious effects, you have the Challenger disaster from 1986, and you have the experience of Boeing in terms of 737 MAX airplane, so beautifully expressed in a book by Peter Robinson in 2021. Right, you can tell the voice is about to crack, so I will stop talking. I hope that's been of some interest, and people are just sitting at home thinking, well, God, that was a difficult listen, and Andy was croaking. And I'll hand over to Philippa.
Thank you. I was just going to say actually that John, did you want to get, given that you were mentioned several times during the last 25 minutes or so, I just wondered if there was something that you wanted to add to that, and maybe Rick, you could also add a spotlight to John as well, so that people can see him.
As always, it's you know, I listened to Mark, and I know the work that I barely recognize it. I think, oh, that was much more insightful than I remember it. And I wrote down a couple of things that really stood out for me, and it is to do that pace does not give space. I'm really struck by that, about how this addiction to speed and its consequences are so negative. And the other image that really came up to me is, again, it's the repopularization of dialogue, which I know a number of people in this group have been, engaging with. I'm thinking of certainly Hugh, have been working on for decades, and the way that it keeps falling out of fashion. And it is this thing about, what is it that it's so bloody obvious that we need to take time to think, we need to slow down. So how come these absurd social workplace practices go without mention? And if you talk to people, they'll say, of course we need to slow down, of course we need to have better conversations, of course we need dialogue to tap into collective intelligence, and yet we don't. It is the persistence of the lack of dialogue that I find I'm troubling, intriguing, worrying. So that's my take on Mark, and I'd like to join in one of the groups, please, because
well, yeah, John, and I just want to just say, I've been sitting here listening, and the reaction it's evoking in me, I mean, I'm fascinated by the angle Mark's taken. I've loved it, and at the same time, the horror of the situation where we are in these machine-like practices has come home to me on this call, and it's made me think about 2 of my 3 big clients at the moment I'm working with in the health service, in universities, and recently in the food system. All of them have in common, you cannot get room in people's diaries. They are so busy. So we want to meet to do some good work. Can we get space to talk about the things that everybody on the exec team wants to talk about? It's really hard in each of these sectors. Nobody's got time to do anything. And when you meet, there are always tears. And I think there's a horror of having the space, because in the space, the real humanness and the reality of what it's like to be human in these machine-like structures actually hits people. And it's terrifying and liberating. So through the tears comes something, but then something else, but immediately people step back into the machine. I was in a meeting yesterday with an exec team in healthcare where we're talking about ostensibly targets and waiting lists and all kinds of things, and there was sobbing of some of the exec members when they had space to really feel how it was to work in this. And I think sometimes the pace takes up all the space because the space is really painful once you're in it. That's one of my reflections. And the other is some of the stuff that comes out, you start to see some of the politics and buy-on patterns and group dynamics that people just don't normally want to look at. Some of the truths of organization that normally get swept aside in the, oh, we haven't got time to do that. We're focusing on item 1, item 5, item 97. When you slow down, take some space, you go, oh my God, we never listened to Sarah. And we hate that. I think I've just noticed some of that in the last 2 weeks in client work. So I just want to say thank you to Mark for giving me the space to connect these dots.
And I think, Chris, that might be a good point at which we ask Rick to put people into breakout groups for, should we be precise to sort of say 12 minutes? I mean, that 15 minutes feels a bit long, because I'd like to make sure everybody can say something, but 12 minutes so people have got the chance just to say hello and then have a conversation. So Rick, if you could work the Zoom magic.
And the invitation is to respond in some way. I mean,
what sense are you making? What's it evoked in you?
Yeah.
Practical examples of how you might
do something with it.
Do something about it, with it and about it, that kind of thing. Everybody here, I'm sure, is is experienced and has experiences. So whichever angle is most interesting to you, as we would always say, if there are choices, go fearward. So Rick, if you can put people into breakout groups, that would be super. So in a minute, you will find yourself in a breakout room. Excellent. Welcome back. So it would just be really interesting to hear from whoever wants to speak about what emerged in your conversation, what intrigued you, what questions you had, and perhaps we could invite Mark and John to respond, or it's just really very much a sort of conversation. So could we invite some brave person to just say something about what went on in your groups? Do you remember what Mark was saying about dialogue? We're kind of.
I'll be brave if you like.
Thank you, Jackie.
It starts off by saying I wasn't able to join the first bit because I had a clashing meeting. So I'm really hoping you're sending the recording out so I can go back and watch it. But for me within the group, what other people, and I'm sure they might come in a second, were talking about, it just really enticed me in straight away, some of the conversation. And I work in healthcare at the moment, and that busyness that you talk about, Chris, and that sort of franticness of it really resonated. And just listening to the other people in the room reminded me how much I see those senior people pulling everything upwards. And for me, there's something about that kind of lack of trust for other people to deliver it, and in not taking the time to frame the problem. This is what I shared with the group I was in. It feels like they don't take the time to listen and frame the challenge, but then be able to articulate it to empower others to do it. So everything kind of gets dragged up to the top of the organisation, and the meetings that they're in are just so full of agenda items. They never really get to cover anything. So yeah, that was the feeling I was left with just by listening to the people that I was in the room with. So really looking forward to listening to the actual playback.
You're actually making me think of a client that I'm working with at the moment, where they are specifically, because they have got so many agenda items in their meetings, where they literally are just starting this month, put in one, I think it's 2 or 2.5 hour meeting a month that they are trying to have agendaless. But I can see they're going to find it. I can see they're going to find it hard. It's going to be really hard to resist the kind of creeping insidiousness of the safety of having something to talk about, things to talk about. Oh, well, we'll just talk about it in that meeting. But
I saw Lisa wave just before. I don't know if you were waving to talk earlier, Lisa, because I was in her group.
I was just going to say thank you for the 12 minutes. And it was a very enjoyable 12 minutes. And I guess just where we kind of got to was that thing about how revolutionary it is to provide this time and space at the moment. And it is like a kind of, the systems are very dysregulated at the moment, and we were just kind of acknowledging that it's a real defense against collapse to keep going, but to put in time and space is extraordinarily powerful and really needed. We talked about a lot more than that, but those are the things I quite liked where we got to with it as a reminder for me.
does anyone else from your group want to share something that might be different, or because you said there were other things you talked about? I have no idea who was in your group, so.
Yeah, I was in that group as well with John and Lisa. The other thing that struck me was two of us talked about how we work with people in senior positions. We work with exec groups, and we're doing that in the hope, perhaps, that there's a trickle down to people who are not in the senior positions. But personally, I'm not confident that that time and that space trickles down just because we're giving it to the people who are paid the most and most senior. And that led us to talk a bit about how do we flip the pyramid a bit? How do we get things like citizens juries working, or bringing the voice of service users and customers more into the system? So no answers, just more questions.
And I was the third in that group, and it was one of the quotes I wrote down was that everybody just cries if you give them space. And it is this idea, if you want to know why dialogue doesn't happen, as soon as you open up the space where people could actually talk together, what you find is just this massive wave of emotional release. And I'm just now reminded, as I speak of that, I keep thinking of the early work in 1917 and the psychoanalytic movement, equipping people to go back to the front line. And it is this thing, you give these people moments of reprieve, but the system they're walking back into is screamingly mad.
One of the regrets I have is that dialogue itself as a reference has been quite distorted, in my view, by the assumption that dialogue is all about talking. It's taken as given that something called Bohemian dialogue involves sitting in circles with one person speaking at a time and following routines and particular rules and regulations about how to speak. And it's been regimented by a process which had very little to do with what David Bohm was preoccupied by, which was the relatedness of everything, of each other. And if we don't attend to the relation and the quality of the relation, there is no dialogue. But that's not what he is remembered for. He's remembered for people sitting in circles, following rules. And I think it's an awkward subject. It seems to have got paralyzed in dialogue is a particular form. You have to speak in a particular way and sit in a particular grouping in order to do dialogue.
Yeah.
I
Laura.
don't know how it's to be recovered.
Yeah,
The essence of it.
I was in Hugh's group with Annette and Fiona. We had a lovely conversation. And I mean, this may seem a really trite observation, but Hugh talking about dialogue takes place when people sit in a circle and take their turn. It struck me that we were 4 people sitting in 4 rectangles. And nowadays, dialogue is moving. It isn't circles, it's this. And this is a very different experience.
Yes, yes.
I think there's more work to be done in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you know, this has made me think about some of the extraordinary work I have seen in this space that hasn't been sitting in circles, where people have a very different experience of spaciousness and time. I'm thinking here of Stephen Harding,
Yes.
who's died recently, and his funeral is coming up at the end of the month, who had this extraordinary capacity to take people on deep time walks, and the whole Schumacher College creation of space to engage differently. In some ways, similarly at Findhorn, in some ways, similarly in some of the things we used to do in some of the programs at Ashridge. And one of the things I notice is that all of those things have gone. The corporate systems in which they sat have collapsed the space in which that work was possible. Findhorn doesn't run programs. Schumacher has just closed its programs. Ashridge, Holt closed those programs. The corporate engine closes it down. Oh, Laura Cream is asking, how do you go on a deep time walk virtually? The work does exist. We probably can't do it on this call, but if you make sure that Richard has your email, I will try to find the people who do that and send you a link. Yeah. But my observation is, I think this work gets collapsed in lots of ways, so that some of the pioneering creation of space is institutionally crushed.
Lisa, you've got your hand up.
I guess I started in a small group saying this, but like, I'm so grateful to have this space this morning, because it's really reminding me to have the courage and ongoing, not that I'd lost it, but excitement about what I am managing to achieve. And I do want to share here, because it's hopeful, that our work with senior leaders in education, has gone from seeing one person to thousands that is currently being funded by the DFE. I'm not quite sure they fully understand what they're providing, but we opened the doors on Monday again. We've already seen 1,500 senior leaders open the doors on Monday, and it was full again. And it's being funded for the 3 years, and that is monthly supervision, time to think, for an hour. And it's so exciting, and it is impactful, because people are then coming to us at My Social Enterprises because they want to carry on, and they are asking for their senior leaders to. In some ways, I've designed it around my experiences in the NHS, and I've taken it across into education because I thought it was needed there. But weirdly, it is taking off with the kind of quality of time and space that is rarely possible in clinical settings. And you just think, because they are desperate for it, they are so on their knees that actually, just quietly, because it's been the charity and the DFE are behind it, people are signing up in their droves. And so I do think that's really hopeful.
You're actually making me think, Lisa, about Chris often talks about Trojan mice. You do something and it starts in a very small way, and actually much bigger stuff happens from that. And that was the image that came to mind as you were talking about. You've started doing it, because if all these formal programs that might put these things into the corporate system are failing, or have closed down for whatever reason, or been closed down, it does strike me that everything we do needs to be very informal, just trying it out, just trying experiments with. So, for example, this client with a genderless meeting, who's all sort of, they've found the courage to do it because they're viewing it as an experiment. They're going to try it till Christmas. And that's fine. because if it
Yeah.
doesn't work, it doesn't work. But
Yeah, but
Or
can I just say,
a meeting without objectives?
yeah.
How
Can
about
I
that?
can I just say I'm just delighted to hear Lisa's story there, because we first met way back in the early days of you doing this work, and it was much smaller then. I'm just delighted to hear the numbers you're talking about.
I think I have one person then.
Was it really?
Yeah.
God, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we made a little. We talked about film, and so we made a little film for you to start introducing it. I think, and it's brilliant, and it's in the thousands. I mean, that's raised my spirits enormously.
I don't think we're jumping up and down about it enough. I think that's what I'm going to go back to Ed Support, my team today, and just go, I've just remembered how revolutionary what we're doing is. So,
Yeah. Being human is incredibly radical, isn't it?
Philippa, can you
I was
explain
really
a bit
struck
more?
from. Oh, sorry, Sarah. Go on.
Can you just explain a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve from the meeting without objectives and agenda? I'm fascinated by that, and it feels so contrary to where my business is and what they do.
Sorry. So the thing I was saying about the agendaless meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, this is an exec team of a higher institution, a higher education institution. And like all universities at the moment, they have a huge number of challenges, financially driven. You know, the whole market's in sort of existential crisis. And they have been trying to think about, they are undergoing a big change. And they realized that all their meetings were just, they were really paper heavy, you know, just inches thick if you were to print it out of things to do. And so actually they were coming to meetings where they didn't feel properly prepared because there was physically such a big pile of paper that they weren't literally getting through all the pre-work. Unless it was sort of specifically one they had to talk to, which didn't seem to be very good. And they also realized they were rushing through agendas. And so what they're trying to do now is to have more a pattern of meetings across their month. They have 4 meetings a month, or they're on a 4-weekly cycle of meetings, and they're trying to have 2 lots of meetings that are going to be coming back to Mark's point about, you know, being in the present and being in the future. 2 lots of meetings where they're going to talk about essentially what's going on today in BAU, keeping the institution going and the stuff that they need to be doing now. Another meeting is all around their big change that they're doing, which is around, and obviously there is a program around that, but they want to focus. They do realize that it's not as cut and dried as this, but they are going to try and have areas of focus. And so they very specifically wanted then to have the 4th meeting, as they've called it, strategy and our development, strategy/development. And the aim of it is, and I don't know how it's going because they haven't had the first one yet. I think it actually might be next week. Is whereby they will have 2 or 2.5 hours together. There will not be an agenda per se. They've decided that when they talk about strategy, they don't mean the current big change that's going on. They want to be able to look further out than that. So and they want to sometimes have somebody to come and talk to them to stretch their thinking. So I think their intention is that somebody might come and talk to them for half an hour or something, and then they have a conversation, remarkably a bit like this, and just whatever comes up. And it doesn't have an output other than to cause them to have a space in which to think and to talk and to think about themselves as a team, and to think about the sector and the institution in the sector, but not just in the next 3 to 5 years, but beyond that.
And Philippa, one of the phrases we use, and I owe this to Howard and to John and to Hugh for teaching me this many years ago, is one of the agenda items we commonly put into designs is space to let the main thing be the main thing. And if you can hold that of having a meeting where you just, what is it? never talk about it. We really do need to talk about it. What do we need to give space to? We're actively working with some clients just to have 2-3 hours, if they're together, to let the main thing be let the thing be the thing.
Thank you.
So in this particular client, they have given themselves space, and they've given themselves a topic only to the extent of it needs to be about our longer term future or about our development. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
I'm kind of
fascinating. Thank you.
intrigued.
Yeah.
I think the work that we did around the title of whirligig,
Yes,
structurally contained quite a lot of a useful antidote to the assumption that strategy was a plan, and I doubt if it exists in Ashby's now, the whirligig, thinking of strategy as a process over time.
yeah.
Just strategy as a process was radical.
And incredibly more. I mean, we find that people wanting to talk about that more today than ever. They always wanted to talk about it, but kind of the world has gone, we really need this now. You know,
I like what Lisa said in the comments. I don't know if people can see it. Supervision is about process, being in the spacious present that allows looking back forward, but no objective other than to be present with whole self at work.
Nice.
And actually made me think, Mark, in terms of being absolutely present. You talked about your voice. You talked about your voice at the beginning, and I noticed that I had to really listen, which made me more present than actually if I could just sit back. And so actually there's something, I'm sure you'd still prefer not to have the condition. I completely appreciate that. But one of the things is about actually, it does make you really listen and concentrate. And the reason I noticed it, I thought, oh gosh, I'm not sure I'd be concentrating so much in normal circumstances, which is quite shaming, really.
Can I just respond to, I think it's Laura, is it? The proliferation of strategy consultants and the lack of dialogue consulting. Yeah, I'm also struck by the difference in the price point. You know, the market rate for strategy consultants is one thing. You know, it's people pay more for strategy consultants than they do for example, restorative justice consultants. Maybe it should be the other way around. Yeah,
or what Stuart was referring to, which is the ability to listen to and work with your staff and your clients. If you work in co-production, which was my background,
thank you.
Or, you know, that is a low price point.
Can I just act as Seema's throat if you can't see what she's written in the chat, because Seema, your throat is too bad to speak. Philip's ready approach offers a view for effective teamwork. 70% content, the main thing, 15% task and process, how we work together, procedures and protocols, and 15% maintenance, who we are and focus on the team. If any one of these is neglected, it will still need to be addressed eventually. That's why away days and team bonding do have an important place, even if the labels are unhelpful. Completely agree. And I notice always that the maintenance process is the bit that often gets squeezed within meetings if the agenda overruns. Yes, we're going to do a reflection. Oh, now it's not 10 or 15 minutes, it's now 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah. Just before the end.
Yeah. I just want to make another connection to some of the things we've had on here earlier, because it's only just struck me. Sometimes people do find it difficult to take space for this, and there are things that help. For example, Doug's Zen doodling.
You want to say a bit about what that is?
Yeah, so our colleague Doug Shaw developed a really simple, and this can be done, it was developed to do on Zoom or in Teams, getting people doing some simple artwork together, just doodling. And he's brilliant at getting people, as he said, drawing things for the bin, you know, no quality required at all in the artwork. But we noticed, and he noticed, that while people are doodling together, the conversation opens out, it expands, it goes into things that nobody expected. And the main thing becomes the main thing because you're distracted by the doodling into not having to worry about how am I turning up, what am I talking about? And some really beautiful dialogue happened. Through doing something else. And I think, Rick, you find that sometimes with the Lego Serious Play work too, is that conversations happen either just in doing the work or in the margins of the work that wouldn't have happened in another way. It's just fascinating. Getting your hands busy gets part of your head out of the way.
I'm just conscious of time and just wanted to make sure that we can all see the various comments in the chat that Laura talking about action learning sets. And you know, absolutely, completely with you on that. And in terms of getting people working live with whatever their real issues are.
Yes.
And Stuart, you made a comment about denigrated past and idealized future. Did you want to say anything about that? Rather than me simply reading it out or just inviting people to have a look at it.
Yeah, I think just have a look at it. It was Mark's comment that I was picking up on and making a connection to where the conversation had gone. So
yeah.
Could I just offer a perspective on what is being said about distraction, so that we let go of the monopoly of what we're supposed to be talking about. There's a book that I've been asked to review, which has the enticing title "Sitting in Stillness," and the even more enticing subtitle is "Freedom from the Personal Story." And I found that immensely helpful in many contexts where people are encouraged to notice how attached they are to their version of the world, their story, the story of the group they belong to, or and having freedom from the story that we tell ourselves is a remarkable subtitle for a book. You almost don't need to read the book, really. It's just sitting in stillness. Freedom from personal story.
Thank you, Hugh. That's absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
I see that Seema and Mark have been having a little thing about the OD, the difference between management consultants and OD consultants, organization development consultants. And Mark, I think you've added, we're coming to the end of the time, Mark, do you want to just, say something more about that, or anything that you'd like to kind of draw out of the conversation you've heard?
There are a couple of things that people have brought up. It chimed with me. It's been such a rich conversation. The first was, I think, Jackie's observation about teams in the NHS pulling stuff up to themselves. There's an interesting contrast. He pulls stuff in a kind of magnetic way, also end up working down, so they drop down into practicalities of the job, and that causes them to get distracted from what actually they're being expected to do. And fundamentally, I think, as Jackie was talking, it chimed with my experience across the NHS for many years, which is there is a significant lack of trust. The NHS is an organisation with 50% of its workforce is professionally qualified. There's very little trust about engaging with those people, giving them the scope to speak, around the opportunity to experiment. NHS boards will go off and pay McKinsey and PwC to produce thick and stupid slide decks, but they will not talk to their people. Well, one of the responses that John and I got in terms of the book, in terms of people's voice and silence, was somebody saying, pretty much, he said, my voice counts for nothing. It's the voice of a consultant has greater weight, which is curious because ultimately that person is in the forefront of the practice of the business and should have the capacity to speak. I was taken by Hugh's observations about relatedness, which is critically important. I think just how do people connect? Because so much of that is particularly with social media, It's about us getting disconnected, and connection is the fun starting point. And I was reminded as he was talking that I do a lot of 360 feedback sessions, and a couple of times quite recently I just thought, this is quite an alien practice. It's not helpful to the individual. It's just pulling in a lot of feedback. What's the person meant to do it? And it doesn't require the person who's the centre of the process to look outwards and say, what context am I working in? Who am I working alongside? How am I connecting to them? So she was talking about relatedness. I was reminded I need to do some more thinking about I got the 360 practice and expect it. And then just find people talking about meetings, and John talk a lot, is so many business meetings are performative. You all turn up because it's scripted. We know what we're going to say. I tell the story of somebody who spoke. She said, every month I produce a board report, so I have to complete it. Board report, and then I go to the board meeting. But I go to the board meeting. I'm not allowed to speak. Only my manager can speak. I just sit there and take notes. Yeah. And that's a prime example of a corporate practice where there is no communication going on. It's just an act of theatre. Yeah. Where people are playing the parts and nothing is happening. It's also deeply insulting. That individual toils away to produce that report every month and then cannot even add a contribution to it.
Absolutely.
It struck me as deeply sinister. So those were some quick observations, and just Seema and I just having a quick exchange of OD stepping up better than it is currently, which is we need to be really cautious with OD. Just don't move into the space. Yeah. The space is there. So many practitioners, and I was one. We like to think of ourselves as light entertainers. We go along and do a show. Come and have an away day. It's going to be a big show. And actually, by turning it into a show, we deny the opportunity for people to talk, because they just become an audience rather than a constituency.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Philippa, I'm really conscious that we're right up against it. Can I just say massively thank you, Mark. I mean, for everything you've said and everything you've invited us to join in with today. We could do this again and have completely new ground. There's so much to talk about in here, but thank you for starting us off. As usual, we will put some reflections in a blog and give a link to Mark's company and his writing and this kind of thing, so you can follow up as you wish. The next pop-up we don't have a firm date for it yet. I think we have a tentative date, Rick, do we? Can you tell me what it is?
The 31st of October. 31st of October.
So there's 31st of October, to be confirmed, is about looking at some of the myths and realities of neuroscience. So an organization consultant, part of our group, very, very experienced, Nick Roy, TAVI trained, does loads of really good OD work, as well as exec development work, is teaming up with Trish Riddell. Trish was reader in neuroscience at Reading. She used to advise us on the neuroscience of Ashridge programs long ago. She's now a freelance neuroscientist. They're going to look at some of the pop science that's going on around neuroscience and its application to organizations, and try to look at some of what is overstretching with science and what is real science that's not getting a fair look that might be useful to us. So that's the next one. We'll confirm it as soon as we can when we write out after this. Meanwhile, Philippa, you want to say anything to close?
I think thank you very much for coming. And if this is your first event like Stuart, you're most welcome to come back. We do host them very regularly. We try to make it monthly, and you're most welcome. And as ever, even if you're only able to join part of the meeting and then you're disappearing, as some people have done, into an underground or had a work emergency, it's just, we like to get together to talk with interesting people and bring interesting people together. So it's been lovely to see you all. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.